Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
And you yourself find yourself in one of these jails right now. We have Yankee gratefully outside filming you because you're not allowed to leave, and you're stuck inside one of these, they call them, I think, government-approved isolation locations, but ultimately they are COVID jails. You are stuck in this building, being forced to pay to stay there. Can you talk about your experience coming into the country, what you expected to happen, and what happened to you?
Absolutely. So basically, I'm coming home from the U.S., and there were no direct flights to Calgary, where I live, only through Montreal. And I'm not naive to the rules, but I was under the impression that I would be required to do the COVID test and be subjected to the COVID jail upon arrival at my final destination, Calgary, not at the point of entry here in Montreal. And at least in Calgary, I would have refused and gotten the $15,000 ticket and fought it in court, but at least I'd be able to go home. So I was quite shocked when I arrived here, and the first question I was asked was, "Are you fully vaccinated?" I thought our leaders said there would be no vaccine passports.
When we bring you news of a Pawlowski being stuck in jail, we're normally talking about Pastor Artur Pawlowski, or even his brother David Pawlowski. But Nathaniel Pawlowski, the eldest son of Artur, finds himself in a jail of a different kind.
I am returning from the United States through Montreal towards Calgary, and I was stopped at the Montreal airport because I am not vaccinated, and apparently you need to take another COVID test, even though I took one yesterday before my flight because they wouldn't have let me on the plane otherwise. But I need another one, apparently, and I have to stay at their government-approved hotel for 3 days awaiting the results.
He is stuck right now in a COVID jail in Montreal. He's awaiting test results. Could be as long as 3 days that he is stuck there. He was in the United States touring with his dad, sharing their important story. Many Canadians are shockingly indifferent to the arrest of pastors and the things that are happening in this country. But Americans, having fought for their freedom and still being passionate Christians, are paying close attention to some troublesome trends that are emerging in this country. I was joined by Nathaniel Pawlowski for a phone call about his experience at the airport and what it's like to be trapped inside a COVID jail. You find yourself in a bit of a predicament that relates to our No COVID Jails campaign to challenge the legality and constitutionality of these COVID jails. Before we get into that, though, for those who aren't aware, maybe you could touch a little bit on why you're outside of the country, what you've been doing with your dad down in the United States, and then we'll get into your current predicament.
Yeah, so I was in the United States with my dad for over a month, where he's on a speaking tour telling his story and experiences both behind the Iron Curtain growing up and his experiences recently in Canada and how similar things are starting to look. How he has been persecuted in a so-called free nation, not just since COVID started, but for over a decade. Some people say it's not Christian persecution, he's just not following the rules and not obeying public health orders, but he's been harassed by the Canadian government since 2005 and 2006 when he was first arrested for publicly reading the Bible. He's been arrested a dozen times, over 100 court cases, 300 tickets, 2 injunctions, 2 contempt of court orders, and of course the famous arrest in the middle of the highway.
Unbelievable. And one of the things we've certainly noticed, Americans seem far more passionate about this story. You can talk to people in Calgary who don't know that pastors have been put in jail. And meanwhile, we have senators and these major high-profile figures throughout the United States speaking out about this story. Can you maybe talk about it, just so people get an idea of the scale? Some of the people who've wanted to meet you and your dad throughout your experiences in the United States.
Yeah, so the arrest obviously brought light to this whole case, right? He was arrested for inciting people to come to church and officiating a church service. This absolutely shocks Americans, and my dad is there to both warn them that this type of government tyranny is creeping into their country as well, but also to encourage them and give them hope that you can resist and fight tyranny. These government officials, lots of senators, DAs, congressmen, U.S. senators are very receptive to this because they value their freedom. They actually care about their constitution and their rights and freedoms, and they're very anti-government overreach. So this sort of story from their neighbors to the north it strikes home for them, because they're starting to see it in their country. It's not quite there, but it's starting to creep in.
Yeah, certainly.
So courage is more contagious than fear. So we went around to about 13 states, and he's still continuing the tour. The reception has been phenomenal. He's treated like a hero and given respect, whereas here in Canada, they hate and paint him as some sort of monster. The fact is that he is facing jail time for his crime of having church. Absolutely appalls Americans, and certain governors like DeSantis said if Florida didn't lead the fight against federal COVID overreach, the U.S. would look like Canada. That should speak to Canadians, saying that, hey, we're starting to look as like countries like China, Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union, where people don't want to be like us because our freedoms are being taken away. So government officials are starting to notice this, and they're starting to watch Canada and what's going on here.
Yeah, certainly. And we've seen it on sort of multiple approaches. My boss, Ezra Levent, often uses this analogy about if you're trying to catch a tiger or trying to catch fish, and you've got like the numerous rings in effect on this net. If a few of them hold, you still have a chance. But we're seeing the judicial system, the healthcare system, everything seems to be folding as once, and these nets that are supposed to keep us safe are falling apart, and we're seeing government overreach. We've seen that with the arrest of pastors, but as we mentioned, one of the other concerns is these COVID jails. People attempting to re-enter the country are facing impossible circumstances, and you yourself find yourself in one of these jails right now. We have Yankee gratefully outside filming you because you're not allowed to leave, and you're stuck inside one of these, they call them, I think, government-approved isolation locations, but ultimately they are COVID jails. You are stuck in this building, being forced to pay to stay there. Can you talk about your experience coming into the country, what you expected to happen, and what happened to you?
Absolutely. So basically, I'm coming home from the U.S., and there were no direct flights to Calgary, where I live, only through Montreal. And I'm not naive to the rules, but I was under the impression that I would be required to do the COVID test and be subjected to the COVID jail upon arrival at my final destination, Calgary. Not at the point of entry here in Montreal. And at least in Calgary, I would have refused and gotten the $15,000 ticket and fought it in court, but at least I'd be able to go home. So I was quite shocked when I arrived here, and the first question I was asked was, are you fully vaccinated? I thought our leaders said there would be no vaccine passports. So here's how it looked. You walk up to the border guard, and he sends you on your way if you're fully vaccinated. But those of us who are not, for example, myself, who cannot receive the vaccine for personal reasons that I shouldn't have to discuss or disclose to you or anyone, being that those reasons are supposed to be protected by the Health Information Act, also the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. But I noticed that this looks like a type of segregation, a medical segregation, where there are people are starting to be put into two groups. And I can't help but wonder what happens to people like me, because are we going to be outcasts of society because we can't receive a flu shot? Are we not going to be allowed to function in society in the same way as everyone else? But back to the story, the border guard sends me to the lineup of outcasts who must be punished for their non-compliance, I guess, where I'm given a semi-choice. I can either get the test and wait for the results at a government-sanctioned hotel for 3 days, or get $15,000 worth of tickets and be denied the right to use any public transportation, and consequently I'd be stuck here in Montreal until I get the test. I have no way of getting home other than by plane. I can't rent a car, I can't take a bus. And it's crazy because I had to pay to get a COVID test before being allowed on a plane to Canada from the States to Canada, which I received the results of in 3 hours, not 3 days, which I have to wait for here for 3 days. I got it in 3 hours in the States. And why do I need a test before the flight and after? What am I going to catch COVID on the plane from all the people who also tested negative prior to boarding?
Yeah.
And even if the COVID test I take here would come back positive, so what? I have to quarantine for 14 days either way. So none of this makes sense.
Yeah.
So I was at the place where you can either receive the ticket and be denied further travel, or book the hotel, which was $1,250 for 3 nights, and get the test. I was willing to get the fine. That wasn't the issue. I was going to fight it in court, but I didn't know how I would get back to Calgary. The border official was filling out the fine, but then said I'd have no way of getting to Calgary. They wouldn't let me out of the airport without providing a confirmed address and proof of a reservation to where I was to stay. So I was basically coerced into this hotel prison option just so I can get home and exercise my Section 6 right of mobility. I mentioned to one of the guards that I left for a month, and I didn't recognize Canada when I came back. It turns more socialistic and communistic every day. She looked at me and she asked, "How is this communism?" And I replied, "The government has to approve and micromanage every aspect of my life, not only when it comes to traveling, but definitely in this specific capacity right now. Everything has to have the official okay from the Canadian Communist Party. My travel within Canada is supposed to be guaranteed by the charter, but now the government is throwing away most of the freedoms, which I've noticed with my dad, including freedom of speech, assembly, religion, and now I've noticed my mobility rights are being taken away. So here I am."
Unbelievable. And then what was the experience like? What's it like? We've seen everything from it's not bad to absolute horror stories, terrible food, limited service. What's your experience been like inside the COVID jail there?
Well, it's a small room. It's not ideal. They send me food, so it's not great food. I prefer to order food myself. I don't really trust their food here.
Mm-hmm.
So Uber Eats is my option. And yeah, it's not ideal, but I'm having a better experience than some of the people that have been here before me. So.
Certainly better than your dad's lodging for a little while there, I imagine.
Yes, exactly. He had 3 days on concrete. I had 3 days in at least a bed.
Why do you think that Americans care so much more about this, that they see what's happening, that they understand it, and that they're becoming passionate when Canadians don't seem to care that people's lives are being thrown upside. People can't come back into the country. People can't freely travel province to province. To the rest of the world, particularly, and pastors being arrested, to the rest of the world, this is alarming, but Canadians don't seem to care. What is the cultural difference there?
Well, I believe that Americans have had to fight for freedom, so I think they have a taste of what it's like to not have freedom. Canadians were sort of given this freedom, and we didn't have to really fight for it. Canadians are more complacent now, and I believe it's because of that. Americans value that freedom because they fought tyranny, they fought in many wars, and they value it a lot more. Their flag means something to them. Yeah. Whereas Canadians they're just okay with all this because it's been handed to them.
Well, I thank you very much for your time. Again, if you want to help Nathaniel's dad, as always, go to saveartur.com, make a contribution. That'll go straight to his legal fees. Also, if you want to help Nathaniel and many others who've been stuck in COVID jails, you can go to nocovidjails.com. We are challenging the constitutionality of these COVID jails in court, and we're going to take it all the way. Sarah Miller of JSS Barristers and some other lawyers from JSS Barristers are waging that war on the constitutionality of COVID jails. I want to thank you so much for your time, for speaking with me today. Hopefully we'll see you soon in Calgary. We do have some Save Artur hoodies for you from our Rebel News store, so I'm looking forward to getting those to you. And if you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you, Rebel News.
I want to thank Nathaniel for his important insights and feedback, for sharing his experience with us. And Nathaniel's not alone. Lots of people have been left with big bills or big tickets if they refused to participate in the unconstitutional COVID jail programs. It's ridiculous that our fundamental rights to mobility are being taken away from us. I want to thank Nathaniel for testifying to that and sharing about his experience, exploring the United States with his dad and sharing their story. If you want to help the fight against these ridiculous COVID jails, go to nocovidjails.com. Of course, as always, if you want to help Pastor Artur Pawlowski in his fight, go to saveartur.com. I want to thank you all for tuning in for Rebel News. I'm Adam Soos. I can't emphasize strongly enough just how important it is that we stand up against ridiculous government overreach. COVID jails are just the latest example, and very few people are fighting back. Well, as always, we are rebels and we are resisting, but we need your help. So I need you to go to nocovidjails.com now. You can learn more and chip in to help us as we fight back against government tyranny.